Oh, hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Mills. I'm an environmental social scientist working at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. So today we're going to be talking about the oceans with some of our ocean heroes, the people working towards conservation and the sustainable use of the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. But first, I'd like to invite Matilda Dunn, one of our brilliant PhD students who organized this event, to talk to you about the Global Development Hub.
Hi everyone, my name is Matilda. I'm a PhD student at Imperial and I've been helping to assist with the Global Development Hub, which launched earlier this year. The hub aims to provide a platform to showcase Imperial's global impact on sustainable development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As part of this work, the hub has been running an SDG of the Month webinar series, which some of you may have attended the other events in this series. During this event, we invite Imperial staff, students, and alumni to highlight their work on a particular SDG. Previously, we've explored SDG 10, reduced inequalities, SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 6, water and sanitation. You can find recordings of all our previous events on Imperial's YouTube page. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy this event on SDG 14.
Thank you, Matilda. So before delving into the Sustainable Development Goals associated to the ocean, I wanted to remind us all about why the oceans are so important for our survival and well-being. So we rely on the oceans for the food we eat, whether this is by directly eating species or by feeding the farm animals with fish meal, for example. Coral reefs are actually one of the protein factories of the world and can yield an average 15 tons of fish and other seafood per square kilometer per year. The oceans have absorbed a third of the carbon dioxide produced by human activities, and 90% of the extra heat trapped in the atmosphere by the rising concentration of greenhouse gases. So in fact, we don't only need the oceans for our species to survive into the future, but we need the oceans to be okay. A fair distribution of the world's fisheries could contribute to substantially reducing malnutrition. And scientists are increasingly finding that just spending time around the ocean is really good for our mental health. But our oceans are in trouble. Certain fisheries are collapsing, they're being polluted, they're suffering from ocean acidification. So by signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals, countries have agreed to change what we can do and to better protect them, right? So the Sustainable Development Goals, they cover 10 targets, which will require changes to what we do with waste, to the levels of carbon dioxide we produce, to how people fish, and importantly, how fish is distributed amongst people as well. So to hear about some of these challenges and how we can tackle them, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Hollie Booth, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the introduction, Marina, and yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm genuinely flattered to be considered an ocean hero for this event. Hang on a second, I'm just faffing around to share my screen. There we go. Can you guys see that? Great. So yeah, thanks again for the introduction, for inviting me today. As Marina mentioned, my name's Hollie and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Oxford. And I also work as a technical advisor for the Wildlife Conservation Society, focusing in particular on sharks and rays in the Southeast Asia Archipelago region, mainly in Indonesia, where I've been living and working for about the last 5 years now. I actually started my journey into Indonesia and sharks and rays when I did my master's in conservation science at Imperial College. And I did a research project on manta ray trade. And so manta rays was sort of my my gateway animal into marine megafauna. And Imperial is sort of very much responsible for guiding me on the path where I am now. So it's a real pleasure to be sort of back here as an alumni and talking about this topic. So my PhD research focuses on interdisciplinary approaches to shark and ray conservation. And in particular, trying to answer the question of how do we get fewer dead sharks in fisheries whilst also maintaining or ideally improving the well-being of vulnerable coastal communities. And I use sort of economic and socio-psychological approaches to understand some of the drivers of shark fishing and to design and evaluate the impact of interventions into shark and ray overfishing. But today I want to talk about sort of a slightly broader topic, and that is aligning ocean incentives to protect life below water whilst also delivering the other sustainable development goals. This is something that's come up quite frequently in my PhD research and in my sort of practical experiences in conservation. So I'm going to get started with why this is important. So as we all know, the ocean is full of life, including large, charismatic marine species such as manta rays and sea turtles, just to name a few. Of course, there are many others. Sharks, whales, dolphins that we all know and love. But unfortunately, many of these species are threatened with extinction. So it's currently estimated that around 1 in 3 of rays, sharks, and their other cartilaginous relatives are threatened with extinction, and that 6 of 7 described marine turtle species are threatened with extinction. And the main threat to all of these sort of charismatic marine megafauna species is fisheries or overfishing. They're caught throughout the world, in some cases as targeted catch, but sort of most ubiquitously as bycatch in fisheries for other commercially important species, such as tuna and prawns, for example. And this situation creates some tricky trade-offs across sustainable development goals. Because solving these threats or eliminating these threats to life below water is technically easy. We can just close all fisheries. But of course, that's completely unfeasible and would result in huge social and economic losses. And so we end up with this sort of balancing act. On the one hand, we've got sort of extremely important roles of fisheries in terms of providing economic value to people, in terms of supporting coastal livelihoods, and in terms of providing food security. And these contribute to sustainable development goals such as zero hunger, for example, but also goals like no poverty, responsible consumption and production. However, at the same time, these fisheries are also threatening life below water. And this can degrade some of the values associated with marine megafauna, such as their existence values or the value of nature-based tourism. And of course, the really important roles that they play in maintaining functional and productive ocean ecosystems. And if species decline too much, this can then have sort of cascading effects in ecosystems and then ultimately impact fisheries as well. And so we sort of have these tricky trade-offs between the sort of important socioeconomic objectives of fisheries on the one hand and the important sort of conservation and ecological objectives of life below water. And so a lot of my work sort of specifically on sharks and rays is thinking about how can we design sort of novel approaches to align incentives towards multiple goals? How can we figure out these sort of always desirable but ever elusive sort of win-win solutions that help to align sort of biodiversity conservation objectives with the socioeconomic objectives of fisheries as well. And so a few sort of suggestions I want to talk about here on my final slide, and then I look forward to hopefully discussing some of these ideas in the discussion afterwards. So first of all, one thing that would be extremely important is to end harmful subsidies in fisheries and to rather adopt the polluter pays principle in the fisheries sector. So what do I actually mean by this? It's currently estimated that there's around $20 billion spent on harmful subsidies in the fisheries sector. So that's subsidies that sort of drive overcapacity and overfishing. And we need to flip this, this expenditure And rather than sort of funding overfishing, rather we need to create incentives for fishers and fishing companies to adopt more sustainable practices. So when I say the polluter pays principle, you can sort of consider bycatch in economic terms as an externality, which is the same as carbon emissions. So you have this sort of negative side effect of these important industrial processes. And ideally, we want fishing companies to reduce this bycatch as much as possible. So by introducing something such as bycatch levies, you could incentivize fishing companies to avoid and reduce their impacts on life below water as much as possible. And then in cases when it sort of technically can't be reduced to zero, companies would pay sort of compensatory funding, which would go towards marine conservation. And given that the end value of the 7 most commercially important tuna species is more than $42 billion, if we implemented bycatch levies just for these species at around 12%, which is sort of estimated discard rate, it would raise enough funding to effectively protect 20 to 30% of the world's oceans. On the other hand, we can also harness the value of nature-based tourism using the beneficiary pays principle. And so there are many people around the world who spend thousands of dollars going on dive holidays to go and see life below water and to go and enjoy healthy populations of marine megafauna species. And to give a few numbers, it's currently estimated that global coral reef tourism generates about $36 billion in revenues, and that the global whale watching industry generates about $2 billion in revenues. But actually very little of this money goes back into protecting the sort of marine assets that are a fundamental part of this tourism industry. And so if we were to sort of adopt these 2 financing mechanisms in which we ask commercial fishing companies to sort of compensate for the negative impacts on life below water, and if we were to ask tourists or tourism companies to invest just a very small amount of their revenues, it could be sort of $5 to $10 per tourist per day on protecting life below water. This could generate billions of dollars, which could then be invested in marine and coastal protected areas and critical habitats, financing the development and provision of socially underprovided bycatch reducing technologies, especially in small scale fisheries where fishers typically don't have the capacity and the resources to reduce their bycatch. And we could establish performance-based incentives for conservation outcomes in coastal communities and fisheries. So we can flip the incentives, whereas rather than sort of over-exploiting marine resources being the main source of economic value, could actually sort of pay coastal communities for protecting and maintaining important ocean assets for current and future generations. And so if we were to sort of combine all of these different approaches, it might help us to sort of align the objectives and the incentives of multiple ocean stakeholders and users towards a more sustainable and equitable ocean economy, where we can achieve SDG 14, life below water, whilst also supporting other sustainable development goals such as zero hunger, no poverty, and responsible consumption and production. So that is all from me. Looking forward to the discussion at the end.
Well, thank you so much, Hollie. That's super, super interesting. So I'm looking forward to the discussion too, but before we start talking, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yves Blanchet, who's a lecturer in climate change and the environment at the Grantham Institute at Imperial, and he works on understanding global biogeochemical dynamics in a changing environment.
Yeah, thank you, Morena. So let me see if I can share my screen. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Yeah, so in following with what Hollie said, so Hollie was talking about the importance of, I think, understanding the environment in order to come up with solutions to actually better manage it. And with that in mind, I here just want to talk about 3 kinds of problems that one faces when we are trying to address the life below water goal. And I'm just going to show you a few examples for each one of these problems that I mentioned. And the first problem that we come up with a lot has to do with lack of data, tool, and personnel. And I'm going to just illustrate what I mean by that in an example. And the idea is that, of course, if you'd like to manage your underwater or your water environment, one of the main things that you need is people and data able to inform policy and people able to interpret or measure things, right? And actually this latter idea can be quite a challenge because good management should almost come always with a degree of capacity building. And that's not always the case. And I'm just going to show you an example of work we did here in the Maldives and how I think we've been able to deliver some good product that will help with that. So the Maldives, for those who don't know, it's a chain of islands just south of India in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And it's a low-lying island nation, right? And this shows a picture of what the Maldives look like from the air. And now I'd like you to think of that from the perspective of somebody who has to manage that kind of environment, right? And so the first thing you note is that most of the nation is actually water. So imagine you were to take England and instead of having a landmass, you'd scattered it in 1,000 islands and you'd have to manage this. That means you can't really have roads that connect cities. You can't really have a power plant that is centrally located that gives power to a lot of people. So the challenges are very, very different, right, in an island nation. So it's a lot of water, huge area, and very little dry land. You're also dealing with very complex and scattered geography in that you have a lot of small islands. Some of them are not completely immersed. They can be slightly underwater. And you see that the whole nation is very scattered. So that makes it very difficult to consolidate either people or policies, essentially. And the last point here is that if you look at this, you might think that the resources are the islands. But actually, most of the resources are actually underwater. They're represented by coral reefs and fish and sea life and these sort of things. And this is completely unknown, right? All you see is sort of blue, but you don't know what's below the blue. And so managing that kind of environment is very difficult because you need to see through water, which is very hard to do. And you also need to deal with a spectrum of scales, ranging from essentially centimeters, if you're thinking about corals, coral heads or fish, all the way to 1,000 kilometers for the Maldives, which is the size of the archipelago. And you have to do that knowing that there's very little data. And in fact, there's currently no model able to simulate the environment of the Maldives. And so that's the starting point where we had when we started that project. And so the first thing we tried to do is actually to better manage that environment. It would be really nice to have a model that simulates the flow of water around the Maldives. If you think of it as meteorology for the UK, it's very useful to know when and where it's going to rain. But if you're an island nation, it's really helpful to know where and how the water flows around your island. And so we try to deliver that. But when we started that project, we found out that actually the nation doesn't even have a map of itself, right? So there's no way to actually develop a gridded bathymetry product on which you can build a model. And actually, if you look at the data on the left here, which are the data available before 2019, this is the kind of resolution that was available in data sets that we had access to. So you see that you can't even see the islands which are on the side, nor the atoll in the middle. So this is completely unusable in order to do actually marine management locally. So the first step was actually for us to create maps of the nation. And we were able to do that by essentially putting together a lot of the data available, navigational charts, and supplement all that with the few high-resolution surveys available near some islands, and actually expanding that using satellite-derived bathymetry in shallow areas. And what you're seeing here now is the product we managed to create. By we, I mean really Shoaib Rashid, who did that for his PhD. But because we managed to do that, we now have a national map that's able to show you where the seafloor is. And because we now have that, we can catalog assets and actually use that to define boundary conditions for the model. And as I said, that's just at the one atoll scale, but we managed to do that over the entire nation. But why are maps so important? Why is it so important that you are able to have to know where the seafloor is, essentially? And the beauty of that is that once you know that, you can actually start to create models that use that information. So on the left here, I'm just showing the mesh that is being used to actually develop the hydrodynamic model around that atoll. And you notice that the sidal mesh is kind of coarse near the edge and very fine near the island. And so that ability to simulate dynamics across scale is really, really important. But that is only possible because we now have a high resolution bathymetry map. But if you then use that map and you apply some laws of physics, what Shuaib has done is actually to simulate accurately tidal currents in that atoll, as an example, but he's managed to do that over the entire Maldives. But essentially, that really matters because now we've created a model that resolves scales that matter for the people that actually live there, right? The local population can use that information. And they can use that information to do all sorts of things, ranging from marine protection, understanding the ecology. So that would be really interesting, for example, to understand where shark and rays live. Like we know they live in areas of strong current, for example, sharks, so they will be near these red areas. Ecology would have to be with maybe dispersion of larvae, where are spawning ground, where do you want to protect your reef, and where can you actually go fishing, and how that changes in space and time. We have a problem of sediment transport, in a sense that if you live in a low-lying island and you're trying to mitigate against the effect of sea level rise and climate change, in Maldives has decided to basically undergo land reclamation exercises. But when you're doing that, you're actually changing the sediment balance of some nearby islands. And so your solution of raising one island can actually destroy a downstream island by changing the sediment sand balance of that island. So that's important to understand. There's safety applications whereby most of the tourism in the Maldives is scuba diving based. And so if you're losing a diver, if you have a model, you can actually predict where it would drift or what would happen. It's very important for marine safety, of course. And more, we have to think in terms of carbon dioxide removal scheme and reef protection schemes, engineering schemes that are being proposed. And the ability of having a model like that lets us approach this kind of problem quantitatively. But of course, when you actually have a model, that's not enough, right? You actually have to make all the results that you have freely available to any stakeholders that actually may have an interest in this. And I think that's an important point of management. And so the way we've done that, we've created a website which you can access as i-hex.github.io. And it's something we call the Island Health Explorer. And what that is currently a growing collection of 24 Google Earth engine apps, essentially, that are basically showing you certain aspects of island properties for the Maldives. So we actually have some apps that tell you something about the local climate. We have some of them that are telling you something about the geomorphology of the island, so how the island itself is changing. We have some of them that are specific to the ocean properties, and then we have some that are like looking at the future scenarios of climate change, and a few experimental that we are growing that have to do with plastic pollution tracking, fishing, ship tracking, etc. And so that's just an example of what you'd get if you go to maybe the Island Shoreline Explorer app of the Island Health Explorer. So you'd get basically a portal like this, where you can just select the island that you're interested in. And for example, for the annual Shoreline Explorer one, what you get is actually lines that tell you how big the island was at a given time. And that's an example for the island of Kudahuvadu, which actually relied extensively on land reclamation. So you see that before in the 90s, essentially, the island had this shape, the green contour, but using satellite imagery of the last 40 years, we were able to actually reconstruct the size of the island. And you can see the steps of land reclamation where you see the airport now at the moment. And if that is something that interests anyone, we're actually looking for partners and funders to actually expand that kind of work, modeling and communication work to other areas, and also maybe expand that for the Maldives itself. So the other problem that I want to mention is the problem of pollution. And that has to do with the idea that a large-scale pollution actually transcends administrative boundaries. Now, our daily life and the way that humans interact with pollution usually has to do with point sources. But if everyone pollutes a little bit, you have global pollution problems, right? And this map is just an illustration showing the change from 1998 to 2012 in atmospheric particle loading. So that's how many particles there is in the atmosphere. So where it's blue, essentially air quality has become slightly better. But where it's red, air quality has become worse. And what I'd like you to see here is that there's been a shift in where air quality worsened, in that it used to be bad in the 60s, 70s in the US and Europe, but air quality has improved in these areas thanks to the Clean Air Act and other regulation. But it's worsened significantly in Southeast Asia. And you see that the Indian Ocean here is particularly dirty at the moment, right? But if you're here showing in yellow and white all the measurements for lead, for example, that have ever been made in the ocean, you see that most of these measurements were made in the Atlantic and are lacking in the Indian and Pacific. And that really means that as the sources of pollution are shifting, if we are actually wanting to track and understand pollution in the environment, we also have to shift our data needs and also the resources that are dedicated to actually make these measurements. And that also involves developing capacity in your region and developing new partnerships with people in these regions. And the last point I'd like to make has to do with pollution as well, but it's the idea of how does one even measure or quantify pollution. Now, if we're thinking about plastic pollution, for example, it's an easy one in the sense that plastic is fully man-made. There's no natural plastic. So detection of plastic in itself is a measurement of pollution. But for a lot of elements in the world, this is not the case. Thinking, for example, in terms of carbon, carbon has a very, very strong natural cycle and an anthropogenic component that's added on top. And actually it took the community, scientific community, roughly 40 years to try to be able to measure the anthropogenic component of carbon in the ocean to within 15 or 20%. And now we actually have to do this for all the elements in the periodic table, if you wish. And here I'm just showing you a result from Clay and Gradle, where he tries to quantify the importance of anthropogenic fluxes to natural fluxes for many elements. And these positive numbers here in log space. So 1 here means that the anthropogenic flux of these elements are 10 times bigger than natural fluxes. And at the very top here, 4 means essentially the anthropogenic fluxes are 10,000 times larger than natural fluxes. And you see that some of the elements that are quite toxic, like arsenic, lead, copper, uranium, mercury, all have anthropogenic cycles that are 10 or 100 times larger than natural cycles at the moment. And that really leads to the necessity to develop a global measurement program that is able to actually measure the state and the evolution of these elements, and also leads to the need actually to develop new tools to be able to develop, to quantify pollution without having to wait 10 or 20 years until you can measure the change, right? And that's where isotopes become really, really important. And luckily, Imperial is lucky to have this group called MAGIC, which is a mass spectrometry and isotope geochemistry group, which actually is able to do some isotopic measurements on very, very low concentration. And thanks to that capacity, we can start to make maps, for example, of lead isotope ratios in the Indian Ocean, and actually try to relate how the isotopic ratios link to pollution. So one can actually quantify pollution without having to wait 20, 30, or 40 years to be able to measure the contribution of pollution. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves. That's super fascinating. So if you have questions for any of our speakers today, please put them in the chat for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And I'm sure you're going to have tons of questions for both Hollie and Yves' presentation because they're amazing. Now I'd like to introduce Marianne Teo. She's a senior integrated marine manager at the Marine Management Organization. And she works on understanding the social and environmental impacts and thoughtful project design in turning research and on turning research into local action. Yeah, over to you, Marianne.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And thanks, Dr. Yves Plancherel and Hollie, too, for your presentations. So what I'm going to do is I'm firstly going to get my slides up. So bear with me while I do that for a moment.
Perfect, it's coming.
Great.
There, that's perfect.
Okay, can you see the slides themselves?
No, now we can only see presenter view.
Okay, perfect. I will try it one more time.
There you go. That works. Oh, now it's gone back.
Oh, no. Sorry, I'm having a few issues with my my thing. Oh,
There.
Marina, would you be happy? Would you be happy to use your slides? Because my screen keeps flicking back and forth. So how am I doing
Yeah,
it?
I can put those up for you.
Thank you so much.
Perfect.
I'll stop sharing for now. Perfect. Thanks so much. Always useful to have these backups. So as I've said, thank you very much for having all of us here today. It's a real honor to have been invited. And as you can imagine, the journey has started at Imperial, and the organizers have suggested I talk a little bit about the journey from Imperial. So what I'll do today is step away from anything technical or scientific and actually just speak about marine management itself. So taking some of the findings and turning evidence into action and how that has been done. I'll speak a little bit about just 3 things I've learned along the way. So on to the next slide, please. So I did start off at Imperial, which I had planned completely to go into science and genetic research. And while I was there, I decided to switch into marine conservation and management. While I was in the UK, I did stints with research groups in London and conservation groups in Indonesia and Malta while working in shops. But it really was Imperial that helped direct me. And with Imperial, I actually applied for a professional development grant and began working with Blue Ventures, which is this brilliant organization that works with coastal communities to rebuild coastal fisheries and conduct conservation work. And this is where I developed that interest in exactly what Hollie was talking about, that the human dimensions of conservation and the trade-offs and synergies between fisheries and conservation. And then from developing that thesis with Blue Ventures, I worked on their Blue Forest team on blue carbon. And this led me then to Southeast Asia. So I went into work on an island in Cambodia, and I've just returned recently from 6 years in Cambodia. This is in Cambodia. It's a really exciting place right now. Marine conservation and MPA efforts were just beginning when I was there. And I worked with a local NGO developing and monitoring what became the country's first marine protected area, training and working with students and working with the government. And then after a stint in the private sector, managing social enterprise and their regional operations, I then got a job, and this is really what drove me into marine management, which I'll speak more about, with an NGO called Fauna and Flora International. This was working with governments and communities and scientists to develop projects to preserve and protect fisheries and biodiversity. And so this grew, and over the last 4 years, this is with my team, I grew this into a large-scale national program that combined both livelihoods for coastal communities with marine conservation and management efforts, which really was an ambition of mine. And without going on too much about this side of the journey, most recently I have, with that program in Cambodia in place, fully funded and with an incredible team, I've now stepped back into work in the UK in the public sector this time, working with the UK government's program to protect 4 million square kilometers of ocean. And I'll speak a bit more about that at the end. But what in responding to the host's request to talk a bit about my journey, I did think that it really shows what has been quite a journey in trying out different sectors and looking at the different sides of what marine conservation is, what ocean protection is, and what fisheries work is. So on to the next slide, please. I'll tell you the 3 things I've learned. Firstly, and this is obvious, but marine management itself is fascinating. I thought it would all be about science in my career, but I've really moved into this marine management. As has been presented at the beginning, oceans play a crucial role in human welfare. There's also multiple rising pressure from human activity. And importantly, a lot of these ocean industries are absolutely critical in defining the future of our oceans, whether it's aquaculture, fisheries, tourism, port development, or conservation initiatives. And so marine management has to be able to work with these industries and work with them well. So this means marine managers, they need diverse cross-sector skills. You need to be able to integrate different approaches from science to policy to on-the-ground management to simply get things done. And that's why I'd say marine management, it's been a completely fascinating journey. There's a real need, as Dr. Plancherel has just said, to turn that evidence into action and long-term change. And marine protected areas, for example, are a good example of this, where these are areas which have multiple objectives and regulations to varying degrees for the ocean. They're experiencing a lot of global attention, and progress to expand these areas is increasing, which is commendable, but the effectiveness of the management of these MPAs is quite uncertain. A lack of resources, data, and personnel, as a fellow panelist has said. So really good marine management is sorely needed. And I just wanted to put a shout out in this presentation that it's a career so far that I've really enjoyed and hope to continue within it. So on to the next slide. An example of what marine management incorporates is the last few years I've been in Cambodia co-designing and managing marine protected areas with coastal communities, academics, NGOs in the private sector. So you end up learning a lot from many different people who are working extremely hard. You develop cross-sector partnerships, includes working with government, leading teams, and reflecting on what Hollie has said. A big part of the work that I focused on was looking at how financing mechanisms can support long-term ocean protection locally. So how you actually direct those levies, those fees to benefit coastal communities, how you manage those funds, how you get legal agreements and entities to manage them. Next slide, please. So this work has been diverse, it's been interesting. People often think of marine work as wildlife, nature, beautiful pictures like this and diving. And while that can be true, the second thing I've learned, if you skip to the next slide, please, is that really it's all about people. So the job is not really working with nature, it's about really working with people. Conservation and environmental management is a social process. People can be the cause of the problem, they can also be the solution. And so to work in marine management, you really have to love working with people. And it is this human dimension that drives me. And I thought I'd put a shout out to some of the incredible people I've met and learned from along the way, be it fishers, government officials, students, or partners. Then next slide, please. Lastly, the last thing I want to leave you with when thinking about SDG 14 is how important it is to collaborate effectively across sectors to get anything done. But collaborating is not easy. It can be really hard to collaborate with groups and organizations who have different approaches. And so the key thing I've learned is that it's an important process, but it deserves and takes significant time and effort. It's the only way to achieve. It's the only way to achieve impact. Hello?
Albie.
I think that's a pet. No worries. So to achieve the solutions we need at the scale the ocean needs, we absolutely need these partnerships. And one last point I'll leave you on is that conservation efforts will break down if they don't resonate with those local needs, with local research, with local knowledge. So it's a really important part of this work that the global community and international programs listen to local needs, use local knowledge to empower local action and leadership. So for my last slide, I just want to share a little bit about the next stage. So really exciting now to work with the Blue Belt program, which is the UK government's commitment to providing long-term protection to a vast area of ocean by supporting UK overseas territories with the protection and sustainable management of their ocean. It's a joint program between the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, or CFAS, as well as the Marine Management Organisation on behalf of the UK government. And it's a real opportunity to translate science and evidence into tailored marine management. looking at surveillance, enforcement, patrols, awareness, social needs, new legislation. And so I'm very excited to be supporting these partnerships, this collaboration, and specifically looking at how marine protected areas can be managed and funded effectively long-term in ways that not only protect the ocean, but also bring much needed benefits and socioeconomic development and well-being to those who need it most. So that's where I'm at. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. It's been a really exciting journey, and thank you to the hosts of today for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was amazing. And yeah, what a journey you've taken. I was just going to ask everyone, so Hollie, if you could turn on your camera as well, please, that'd be great. Thank you. And now we'll just have a few questions. We've had some pre-submitted questions, but please also, for the audience, if you have any more questions for our incredible speakers, please add them to the chat. I'm going to start with just going on your point, Marianne, on partnerships. So one of the questions that was submitted before is, what types of partnerships do you think that are most impactful for SDG 14?
Thank you. It's a good question. Thank you. I'll have a go, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists. But I think some of the most impactful partnerships, or some of the ones that most excite me, are where you have that bring together socioeconomic development organizations alongside environmental and research organizations in ways that are focused on coastal needs at either a national or even regional scale, but also at that local scale. For example, in Cambodia, the program that I mentioned brought together local nonprofits and technical partners like fisheries agencies, academics, and conservation NGOs, who I might call the usual suspects, but also developed a program in partnership with an online open access platform, youth groups, but also social businesses to support small and medium business development in coastal areas and supporting female entrepreneurs. So it's partnerships that can perhaps change the space. So it's not just a couple of sectors working together, but it's looking at partnerships that can move forward with sustainable development that meets the needs of communities and people, as well as helps sustainably manage and protect the coastal and marine areas.
Oh, great. Hollie, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. Also, just to say I'm really sorry about the interruption to your presentation. I had to break my dogs up from flying, and I didn't realize I wasn't on mute, so I apologize. Yeah, so I think I would agree with Marianne's points, and to maybe expand on it. I think partnerships between sort of private sector and coastal communities, I think direct partnerships are tricky, so probably also kind of coordinated by NGOs, for example, are extremely important. I think in the past, conservation focuses a lot on coastal communities because those are the people sort of living with the wildlife and in direct contact with the wildlife. But I think increasingly it's acknowledged that it's actually sort of wealthy countries, global supply chains that are driving the degradation of nature and life below water. And so we sort of need ways to protect the resources at their source, but doing it in a way that sort of is equitable and promotes social welfare. And so I think sort of holding the private sector accountable for their negative impacts on marine resources, and through that kind of supporting coastal communities to do conservation better, and through that creating sort of a wealth redistribution mechanism as well, it is really important. So I think ways in which we can sort of have these sort of public-private partnerships or private sector NGO community partnerships are going to be really important for sort of pushing the needle on holding holding companies accountable for their impacts on the environment, and having to improve conservation in a sort of equitable way in coastal communities.
Cool. So I might stick to that point. So you're talking about improving, I guess, the condition of the resources and equity. One of the people in one of the audience members asked how much is achieving SDG 14 dependent on achieving other SDGs first, or how much or how dependent is the success of other SDGs on SDG 14? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a quick one to add, and then I'll let the other guys talk. I think we have to achieve, I'm trying to remember like what they're actually all called, but sort of responsible production and consumption. If we don't achieve that, we're not going to achieve SDG 14. That we're going to have more people in the world who are wealthier and are wanting to consume more protein in the next decade. And if we don't sort of figure out how to feed the world sustainably, then we're going to struggle with our sort of life on land and life below water SDGs for sure.
Thank you. Yves, do you want to contribute to that, or?
Yeah, no, I think what you say is very important, and I think that SDGs were all designed to be codependent, and because they are people understand there are co-benefits. You can achieve SDG 14 by working on education, for example, or on climate change, which is a big one. And so all of those really will feed on each other, and it's a matter of trying to make the best effort that you can at the local level, on all the fronts essentially. And if you have any gains on any one of them, you'll have benefits on all of them. So I think that's the main point here.
Thank you. That's yeah, I definitely agree. So, and one question that we have for all of you actually is, what can we do as individuals in our daily lives to contribute to achieving SDG 14? Like what are simple things that somebody who's living in London, Hollie, I think, where are you, in Indonesia? Yeah, so, or someone living in Indonesia, what is it that we can do every day that would actually help out and have a big impact?
Maybe I can try. You?
Yeah, you go.
I would say,
well, I want to hear from everyone, but Yves, you start, please.
I mean, I think in London, you'd be like consumer choices are a big one, I think. But as Marianne said before, local action is really kind of what's needed. And so, yeah, you were mentioning Hollie's in Indonesia, and I think what she would do there would be different. You might have a more direct impact based on other actions, right? So I think everybody has to be aware of what they can do given their context, essentially.
Yeah, so maybe I can go on, Marianne. It's okay.
Are you sure? Okay, I was just.
You go.
I was going to follow on from that. Yeah, I completely agree. It's going to be very diverse what you can do depending where you are. If you can in the UK or in London, join a local group, attend awareness events and activities that others are raising. I think at a minimum, just help the energy and enthusiasm wherever you are to grow. But I think for those, and this I specify, this is for those who can, I think what Hollie raised about that, private sector partnerships, if there's a way that you can invest your money more wisely, so either invest directly in businesses that have a more positive, well, an directly positive impact on the environment, and look and keep an eye out for these new types of financing funds and investments that are developing that will either support businesses that do things a bit better, much better, or even investments in financing mechanisms that can directly support sustainable coastal initiatives and communities. These exist, they are still developing, but I think that's a direction of growth that's worth keeping an eye out for, that everyone who is able to can look into.
Yeah, so maybe I can add to that as well. I think this is a really interesting question, and I think, sometimes people feel powerless with these kinds of issues, or they're like, oh, it's so far away that it's somebody else's problem. It happens over there, especially when people are sort of disconnected from their food sources, for example. They don't think that it's anything to do with them. but I actually think that everybody has kind of the power and the responsibility to make a meaningful difference. And there's lots of talk about sort of transformative change in order to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. And I think there are debates about whether that involves individual behavior change or whether that involves like systems change and political change. And actually we need both, and everybody can contribute to that. So I think on the one level, there's sort of individual consumer choice. And as somebody kind of in London, you can make conscious choices every day to avoid and minimize your impact on the environment with the food that you eat, the packaging that you buy. You can choose to not eat fish, or you can choose to only buy fish that is, Marine Stewardship Council sustainably certified fish. Or you can choose to only eat fish on a Friday or something like that. And you can also use your voice to drive political change. You can sign petitions and vote for politicians who care about the environment. And you can also, as Marion said, use your own resources to sort of renew nature. I mean, maybe I can give a sort of shout out to another initiative that I work on at Oxford called the conservation hierarchy. It's called 4 Steps for the Earth on Twitter. And we sort of talk about 4 steps that everybody can take, which are initially to sort of avoid and minimize your impact on the environment as much as possible through your daily decisions, and then to try and sort of offset any impacts you do have through sort of renewing nature, either in your own back garden or through donating to charities, so that you can become sort of nature neutral in your daily choices. So I actually think there's lots of things people can do in terms of individual consumer choice and using their voice to encourage other people to change, to vote for the right politicians. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And do go and look up conservation hierarchy, 4 Steps for the Earth. A little plug there.
Sounds good. It sounds really good. So just in this, Marianne, just I guess linking up to, I guess, your job at the moment, right? You're working with the UK government. Somebody or Marita Sean actually asked from the audience, how do we increase the political attention and funding that the government would actually be able to dedicate to achieving SDG 14? Like, what is there anything we can do, like lobbying? Is there, like, what's the best way to do that?
That's a really good question. So thank you, Marie, for that one. I think it does relate to what we've just been talking about in terms of the action individuals can do. I think to get more political attention to this, I think more voices coming together and speaking as one. So look out for these, for the campaigns that are active. Look at for either local groups or organizations and NGOs that are supporting causes that you really care about. And look at the ones that are working with the public sector, working with these other initiatives and sectors as well, so that they also, they have a good understanding and hopefully can also campaign and lobby and make change and call for change in the most effective ways. On the funding side, I think that's a really interesting question. That's something that is at the top of many people's minds. Obviously, things change with COVID, priorities change, but with the voices, with the calls, with the international and scientific support and evidence, ocean conservation and protection and sustainable management is at the top of many people's agendas, at least when it comes to the environmental and resource management sphere. So I think keeping that high up there will help with the government funding. But I also do think that looking at delving into new types of revenue, so increased philanthropic funding, increased private funding as well, that works in partnerships, can be a real opportunity that can be developed to support SDG 14. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much for all our panelists. Thanks to our audience for your great questions. I'm going to have to wrap this up because we're going to have to finish on time. But yeah, it's been super inspiring. I hope you've all learned a lot. I hope you're all good. Everyone who's watching is going to be thinking about what you can do today to have a positive impact and contribute to SDG 14, and at least minimize any negative impact that you might have on the oceans, because they really are so important to our survival and the well-being of everyone around the planet. So I'll just pass you on to Matilda Dunn, who's going to tell you a little bit about the next event and ask for contributions.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you so much to our speakers. So the next SDG of the month is going to focus on SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production. We're looking for submissions of research, innovations, or any kind of projects to highlight what Imperial is doing for this SDG. So if you have any suggestions, or if you yourself work in this area, then you can just email the International Relations email, it's right there. And yeah, just let us know. We'd love to share all the amazing work that Imperial is doing for this SDG. Thanks very much, everyone. And also look out for the recording of this event and our other SDG of the month events on Imperial's YouTube.